So good morning, everyone. The topic for today is why mines fail. It's more of a kind of a shock topic. It's not as probably severe as you think. Arthur, is there a sponsor for this session? So no sponsors to thank for this session. But there are two ways of looking at this topic. It's failure to achieve targets, or in my perspective, failure leading to mine closure. The presenters today will cover a few of the areas which should be considered when reviewing the risks associated with the mine and how to get the most value out of it. So, as Arthur mentioned, there's been a change of the agenda, and this is my colleague Guy Dishaw, who will present on, where is the metal? Bulk density considerations for advanced mining projects. And Guy is a principal resource geologist with SRK. Thanks, Guy.
All right, thanks, Chris. Yeah, where's the metal? So this is a question I think, as a geologist, I've certainly been asked a number of times. When new mines are opening, old mines are reopening, things get pretty stressful. They're challenging times at operations. And we want to make sure that we mitigate any risks possible that we can to ensure our success. Bulk density is one of the risks that I've commonly come across in my role as a consultant that is commonly overlooked in mining projects and can lead to some significant issues with mining plans. All right, just to get a couple of definitions out of the way quickly so we know what I'm talking about here. Of course, density is mass per unit volume. I'll be talking about dry bulk density today. In mining projects, we typically are using dry bulk density because our measurements of our grade, metal grades like copper, gold are done by dry weight. So the analyses that are done at the labs are done by dry weight. So in most cases, we're talking dry bulk density. At a lot of sites, metal sites, they'll be measuring specific gravity by water immersion methods. Because we're using water as the immersive liquid, which density is very close to 1, we're effectively measuring density. And the last comment on this slide is, well, what's metal? Our project volume is, our project value is volume multiplied by our metal grade, multiplied by bulk density. So these are proportional. If we have a 10% issue or a 10% error in our grade or a 10% error in our bulk density, that will translate to the same error in our metal contained. So there should be considered equally. All right, advanced mining projects. We want to be able to declare mining reserves in order to develop our mining plans. In order to do that, we need measured and indicated resources. In order to declare measured and indicated mineral resources, we need reliable grade and density information. Density being just as important as grade here. Now, despite this, many projects spend little or almost no time on density measurement or estimation of density. Commonly, we'll see sites that have in the order of tens of thousands of samples or measurements taken for grade and maybe tens of samples taken for bulk density. The measurement of bulk density at a lot of the mining sites will be done by simple methods, water immersion methods. Some more, if we've got better ground conditions, some sites use caliper methods. But there's some other methods as well that some people might not be familiar with that don't measure dry bulk density directly, but measure it indirectly and may be applicable depending on your project, like downhole geophysical techniques that measure in situ bulk densities, pyknometry that a lot of labs offer that measure grain densities, and then of course if you've got simple mineralogy like a massive sulfide deposit, we can be using stoichiometry to calculate our density using linear or multilinear regression techniques. Most important thing, though, that I want to focus on here for density measurement, though, is representativity of sampling. So one of the most common failings that I see in density collection programs is selection bias. And I'll just draw your attention to the picture on the, okay, I don't know how to work the laser, but the picture on the left, which is core boxes of very altered and broken rock. The sample that's been taken out of these two boxes to measure for density is of course the most intact piece, which you can see has got some red marker on it there. That's not a representative sample, as you can see if we said that the density of those two boxes is the same as that piece of core. But that's quite commonly what happens, because that's what procedures are developed at a lot of sites that say things like, well, we need to take a 20 centimeter piece of core and measure it by a water immersion method. It's not representative. Similarly to grade, we need to be able to rely on our density measurements. So density measurement programs should have quality controls in place like we have for measuring grade. If we're looking at assays, we have standards, we have duplicates, we have blanks to monitor the reliability of our measurements. We should have similar things in place for our density to make sure that we can demonstrate to our peers that the measurements we have collected are reliable. Once we have our measurements, bulk density measurements, we need to estimate these into a resource model to be able to use it in a mining plan. We need to be able to estimate appropriately the density in the model to reflect the variability of the density in the ground. Your geologists at your site will know what the density should look like in the model. They'll know what controls the density, but what happens here is that there's a disconnect usually between that data collection and the model, and those observations aren't reflected in the final model. An easy technique to use to take observations from the field and demonstrate them and use them to inform a model or bivariate statistics, where we look at, for instance, at the top graph here is average densities by lithology. You can see different lithologies have different densities. A very common observation is our lower graph here, which is dry bulk density by downhole depth. If you're working with a superficial deposit that's been exposed and is weathered, you'll have a profile like this. The profile depth will change, but you will have less dense rock near surface that's been more weathered, gradually increasing in density to depth, where it finally plateaus where we have our fresh rock again. That's a very, very common trend we see. Similarly, we also see some metal grades will impact our bulk density as well. The top graph here is a massive sulfide deposit where we've got iron plotted versus density. In these cases, we can supplement our measurements with stoichiometric calculations with linear or multilinear regressions. Now, the last set of slides I have here are a case study of a copper porphyry project, just to demonstrate how how measurement error and inappropriate estimation can lead to some issues with the mining plan. So in this case study, we've got a copper porphyry project. The upper 50 to 150 meters of the deposit has been affected by weathering and groundwater, which has created a extensively fractured zone. The project is advanced. Over 1,000 drill holes drilled at this site, and over 20,000 specific gravity measurements or bulk density measurements collected using water immersion methods, with quality control in place to ensure that their scales were calibrated accurately. So this is an anomaly for the amount of data collected, but there's still significant issues in this program. So this case study, I'll demonstrate two issues with this density measurement and estimation for this project. Now, just a general cross-section of this deposit, we have a profile from overburden through into the rock, the ore hosting rock, with a broken zone with variable thickness, and then at depth, 50 to 150 meters depth, we are into intact rock. The way these rocks look, this is an outcrop picture. We see the overburden or the glacial till at the top of that picture, and some severely weathered rock, very broken rock below that, containing the copper mineralization. Now into some core boxes further down this broken profile, we can see we got some pretty altered and weathered rock, very, very broken up rock. The sampling for bulk density in these areas from the core, the protocol at site was to measure a 20 centimeter piece of core. Finding a 20 centimeter piece of core in these core boxes was extremely difficult. So when measurements were taken, they were not representative of the entire thickness of this broken zone. Here we are a little bit deeper down, still a little bit weathered, but getting a little more intact. And then once we clear the weathering zone, we're into much more intact rock, where we don't have to worry now about the competency of the rock or finding a 20-centimeter piece of core. So the sample selection bias that I mentioned before, trying to find a representative piece of core to measure by water immersion methods, can be impossible. So in these cases, so in fact that technique of water immersion method really isn't applicable for this broken zone. So at this project, a downhole geophysical tool was brought in to do downhole surveys with a gamma probe, which measures in situ bulk density. And what I've got here on the graph is bulk or specific gravity or bulk density on the y-axis and downhole depth on the x-axis. The samples taken by the geologists from the core water immersion methods are shown in the black line. And you can see at shallower depths the densities are, from the measurements, are lower, and there is a small amount of trend there before at about 150 meters the density plateaus. But when we do the downhole probing with the in situ bulk density measurement, that's the green line we see on this, and we see a significant deviation in densities from about the 50-meter mark, well, right from surface all the way down to about 150 meters. Now that gap between the two plots there is our sample selection bias, and in this case on this drill hole, that's over a 5% bias, or a 5% error, sorry, in the bulk density. To compound the issue here with the project, in the estimation technique applied to assigning bulk density to the broken zone, an average was taken of all of the measurements in the broken zone and applied to the entire volume. So the entire volume of broken zone was given the same density, an average of all the measurements taken in that volume. Now, what we did was make adjustments to account for sample selection bias, and then also applied a more appropriate estimation technique to see what the differences would be to a production plan. And in this case, I'm talking, it's a superficial deposit, and we're looking at an open pit mining plan here. And what I've got on the plot here is years across the x-axis and recoverable tons and metal on the two y-axes. So in this, what I called scenario 1 graph here is just taking into account that sample selection bias that I showed in the previous graph. In years, and I'll go with the colors here. In blue is your predicted tons from the model, the blue bars, and in red is your actual tons from the model. In years 1 and 2, we have a 6% deficiency in metal actually coming out of the pit than we do from the mining plan. And it gradually decreases. By year 6, we only have about a 1% difference. And that's because as we mine deeper, we mine through the area where we have the greatest sample selection bias, and we get into an area where our sampling is actually more representative of the rock, more close to that sort of intact rock area. Now, if we compound this issue by the inappropriate estimation technique that was used by averaging the values through the broken zone, this exaggerates the effect. Now, in years 1 and 2, we would have a 9% and 7% deficiency in metal produced from the pit. But as we approach year 4 in this production profile, we actually have an even reconciliation at year 4. And then, in fact, by year 5 and 6, we start to have a positive reconciliation. And again, that's because of the averaging of those density values over the entire volume. So in the six-year plan, by averaging, we will get the amount of metal we predict out of the model in 6 years, but in years 1 and 2, we will have a deficiency of almost 10%. And the issue being is, of course, years 1 and 2 are some of the most important years of our mining operation, and they're not the times at which we want to have a 10% metal deficiency reporting to the plant, because we most likely have a number of other challenges that we need to overcome. So for your project, you need a systematic process in place for the measurement and estimation of your dry bulk density, just like you will have for your grade. The system needs to take into account that you need representative sampling. Again, as I mentioned, that's one of the most common deficiencies I see in data collection programs for dry bulk density. We need to collect enough sample that we can demonstrate the variability of the bulk density within the project, and we need to have a quality control system in place for dry bulk density so we can demonstrate to our peers that our results are reliable. And then once we are at the estimation stage, we do need to make sure that the estimation approach we take takes into account the geologist's observations of the field, so our model represents reality as best as we can, which is the best way we can de-risk our project from an issue with dry bulk density like this, and ensure that the metal that we are predicting from our model is the metal that we're going to see in our plants. All right, thank you.
Thanks, Keith. So the next presenter is another colleague, Hanno Byers, who was originally scheduled for session 2, which is being brought forward. And he is a senior open pit mining consultant with SRK. And the topic of his presentation is value-adding principles for conducting a mining conceptual study. Thanks, Hanno.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for this opportunity to present some of our findings on how to conduct a conceptual study that adds value. So the goals of this presentation, firstly, I just want to summarize some of the multiple purposes of a conceptual study. So for this presentation, a conceptual study, as you can see there on the little picture on the right, would also cover as an umbrella word, the terms scoping and desktop study, which is interchangeably used in the industry, referring to that early mine development studies, which would typically form part of your three-phased approach to mine development. So I'm going to refer to conceptual studies mainly, but it could also mean scoping or desktop study. Further, I also want to establish a premise for defining what is it that adds value in early mine development. I also want to look at the need, why a conceptual study needs to add value, and also convey to you 10 principles that are crucial to the success of a conceptual study. One of the ways that best explains what do you want to do in a conceptual study. On this slide there, we've got some pictures of concept cars and how the automotive industry uses a concept to eventually arrive at a car. So concept cars are designed to test a concept. The picture there on the slide is of Aston Martin CC100 Roadster, which is built to celebrate the 100th birthday of Aston Martin. This was a kind of a record in that they went from concept to implementation in 6 months. It was built to also encapsulate the spirit of Aston Martin. It has got bits and pieces of each Aston Martin in the car, the final design. So in essence, that's what we want to do with mining conceptual studies and mining development. You want to take bits and pieces, high-level assumptions from experts, speculative geology, and you want to combine it into a concept that makes it presentable and encapsulates a potential future reality. So the graph on the right shows basically that conceptual studies is the first part of your three-phased approach to feasibility. Why do you have 3 phases? Well, with each phase you aim to reduce more and more risk in developing your mine. So the graph suggests that a conceptual study could potentially have the highest impact on your value of the project. So it can also be seen as a stepwise risk reduction process to mining. Whereas a feasibility study would be based on some scientific data and detailed engineering design, your conceptual study would be based on high-level assumptions made by experts, speculative geology usually, and it can add a lot of value if you have a reasonable approach and you do the right things at the beginning. It can also destroy a lot of value on the other hand. So some of the other purposes of a conceptual study, you might want to use a conceptual study or a scoping study to motivate further exploration. You also might want to use your conceptual study to motivate an investment decision. It's also, as we've heard yesterday from some of the speakers, it provides a platform for financial institution early involvement, and you would also want to detail scope for future studies in your conceptual study. So why do we need conceptual studies to add value? Well, the picture on the right explains it. You don't want to be designing at this early stage a sports car and then it comes out as a toy car. I'd say the vice versa is also true. You don't want to be designing or presenting a concept that's a toy car, but it could actually be a sports car. So without proper structure and outcomes defined, a conceptual study could be prone to two extremes. You could either have an over-optimistic evaluation or valuation, or you can actually relinquish a viable project this early in mine development. At a fairly recent Association of Mining and Exploration Companies annual conference held in Australia, it was stated that 83% of scoping studies presented to the ASX were of poor quality. So controversies over disclosure standards were highlighted or identified as one of the main causes. So conceptual study could be subject to a non-systematic, non-uniform and non-standardized approach. And this also makes it really difficult if you want to compare conceptual studies. A large mining company might have one feasibility study running, one or two pre-feasibility studies, and maybe even 5 or 6 conceptual studies. So how do you decide which of the conceptual studies you want to take further in mine development? Well, in this case, it would be important that they are comparable, so you can compare apples with apples. So how did we determine what adds value in a conceptual study? I did a literature survey and some case study research, and this was presented to a focus group of industry professionals, and from this we concluded with 10 principles that is important when we do conceptual studies. So the premise for how do you add value in early mine development? Well, you need to focus on those things that actually reduce risk, because it's part of a stepwise risk reduction process. So the first principle, competent, experienced professionals should be involved in conceptual studies. The bulk of your information is from professionals, experts in the field, knowing the mining tenure, the type of metal, and all of the risks associated. It's crucial also that non-geodisciplines be involved as soon as possible. Many projects have suffered because it did not realize until late that more representative metallurgical information should have been collected at the beginning of the assessment. So as Dilbert says there at the bottom, I didn't have any accurate numbers, so I just made up this one. It says studies have shown that accurate numbers aren't any more useful than the ones you make up. His boss asked, how many studies showed that? He says 87. So we don't want to be like Dilbert and just within conceptual studies come up with guesswork or educated guesswork. We also want to be very transparent and make sure that everything that we assume is clearly documented. Information on the design, method of mining, beneficiation, OPEX and CAPEX are mostly taken from experience, but also from reports, case studies, and published literature in your conceptual study. So it's important that all of the assumptions are clearly stated. The findings within a conceptual study should also be substantiated by engineering and scientific methodology. Nearly every exploration project can be shown to be worth of further development based on casual educated guesses and optimistic, simplified or even biased evaluations. The SAMRE code is very specific in that you need to substantiate knowledge with tested procedures and methods. So it's crucial that we supplement our opinions with engineering methodology. Time and effort spent on a conceptual study should be relative to the geological information available. Care should be taken not to over-engineer speculative geology. Conceptual study can take between 2 weeks and 9 months to complete, depending on what information is available. The risk assessment should be done at the beginning of a conceptual study. Usually we leave risk assessments to right at the end of a study, but conducting it at the beginning of the study helps you actually to think about those things that are important and add value right at the beginning. So it helps you to focus on the right things and focus on those things that would add value. Economic data, CAPEX, OPEX, cash flow, should be presented in a stochastic manner in a conceptual study. And the reason for that is it also helps the reader to understand the potential variability of the project outcomes. It also needs to be, you need to be clear on the basis for this variation, often referring to the most important information in your conceptual study, which is your mineral resource and the level it's at. It's also important to have a set of deliverables identified at the outset of the study. I've included in the box just deliverables as cited by these authors in the green at the top. So knowing where you want to end up with, what you want to end up with is crucial. You might want a certain amount of detail in your mine design because you got classified geology already, whereas with infrastructure you only want to set scope for what needs to be done in the future. As mentioned before, conceptual studies should be conducted in a repeatable, standardized and structured manner to ensure that you can compare conceptual studies. So on the one hand, you want your conceptual study to interpret relevant available information. Where information is not available at present, you want to set scope for what needs to be done in future studies and which areas need the most attention. So just one example, the first point there in a suggested structured approach, a multidisciplinary site visit, you want to send the right experts to your site. If you've got a mineral sands deposit in Senegal, that's right next to a village, you probably want to send your environmental and social experts as soon as possible, because if you're going to face a potential village relocation, it's important to get involved with the right people on site as early as possible. So you want to make sure that you cover yourself in all of the risks in your conceptual study from the start. The valuation of a conceptual study, the valuation accuracy of a conceptual study should be logically derived. So these authors state that a conceptual study at this high level point can be between 30 and 50% accurate. It's also important in your conceptual study to state the basis for your expected accuracy. And lastly, as I've mentioned before, a very important part of a conceptual study is to set scope for future work. Often it is implied that we set scope by investigating a project in early mine development, but it's also important to actually go and work out what exactly is the scope, how much is it going to cost, what needs to be done in future mines, and have that documented as a means to have to make an informed decision to continue with the project to the next phases. So these 10 principles, we firmly believe that these would add value to your conceptual study, and it would add value in ensuring that your early mine development project reduces risks up front. There's a couple of references for some more reading on the topics. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hanno. The next presenter is Thomas Meir, who is a partner with the ERM Group, and his presentation today is Safety in Mine Design, Construction and Operation. Thanks, Thomas.
Thank you. Good morning. Who in the audience remembers this picture? You don't? Nobody? In August 2010, the Copiapo mine in Chile collapsed, and 33 miners were caught 700 meters underground. And this guy holds up a piece of paper where they have written on that they are fine. And they were caught underground for 69 days, so more than 2 months. Media coverage was quite broad and focusing on the fact that they could all be saved and rescued. But the event did not come out of the blue. The mine was known for being unstable, and they had a series of incidents, including 8 fatalities leading up to this incident. If you look at this chart, just a few selected incidents from other mines where many people were not so lucky. Just to talk about a few of them. There was an incident in South Africa, Vaal Reef's mine in '95, where a locomotive ran through 4 levels of safety and fell into a lift shaft and killed 105 people in one go. They left behind more than 400 dependents without income. And the management was not able to explain how that was possible and how that could happen. Or in Romania in the year 2000, we were talking about that yesterday, you had a tailings dam failure that was causing what was called the worst environmental disaster in Europe since Chernobyl, polluting rivers, including the Danube, with cyanide, and killing no human being, but probably hundreds or thousands or millions of animals, and polluting the whole environment for at least 2 years. Management was actually blaming heavy snowfall as the root cause for that incident. Or take the Soma mine disaster, which is the most recent one on this page. In Turkey, in the year 2014, in the coal mine, an explosion caused an underground fire, which killed more than 300 people in one go. And you probably will remember the president of the country talking to the people. I don't want to refer to what he was saying, but a couple of months before that incident, workers were protesting about the bad safety standards and circumstances in that mine. But the government was not willing to take any precautions. And there are many, many, many more incidents like this that you can find. And I don't know how many people have been killed in mining incidents. I've been exposed myself to a few. but it will probably be in the hundreds of thousands of people. I know just one number was stated about South Africa, where it said that 69,000 people were killed in mining incidents in the last century in that one country. So why am I talking about this? It's about preventing people from dying. It's about preventing having accidents. And it's possible. But before we go there, let's talk about what's actually the impact of a fatality. Yeah, it has a devastating, immediate and long-term impact on people. People are dead, or in a less worse case, but still very serious, life-altering effects if they're not killed. And that is an irreversible impact on life and health. Families are left behind. Just think about the 400 dependents in the case of the South African mine. They were left without income. Okay, they were founding a foundation to cover for that. But that's all reactive. There is traumatic experience for witnesses, for relatives, and for friends of those that are impacted. That alone should be enough reason and motivation to work on safety and prevent these things from happening. But there is also a good business reason. There's a safety culture that's being impacted. There is a long-lasting reputational impact on your company. There is the potential, the risk of losing the license to operate. And always there is a loss of assets and production connected to this. And yes, last but not least, incidents are indicators for operational performance issues. So what is actually influencing the safety and influencing the behavior of people that lead to safety events? We are typically working on establishing rules and procedures, written forms and documents to influence the behavior. Does that work? Do you change your behavior because somebody has written a procedure? I don't. It's about the mindset of people. It's about establishing values and influencing the thinking of the people, of the miners that work in your mines. It's about establishing a culture where you have common values and strong operational discipline and proud to follow those rules because you understand they are necessary and they are there to protect the life of the people, of the employees, and to protect the company. Now, if you look at just the factual things, here are the key risks of mining incidents: ground or strata failure, fires, floods, explosives, mobile equipment, and so on. You all know better than I. And we are focusing on them. We should also focus on the cultural aspects of how we are leading our operation. Safety, leadership, and commitment. The responsibility. It's not the safety manager's responsibility. It's everybody's responsibility. It's the leadership's responsibility. Understanding risks, risk identification and control, training, communication, not just putting a poster on the wall or something on a video screen or something. It's talking interactively about what can be done to prevent things from happening. Intervening, not letting people behave unsafely and not intervene, but addressing it. If you don't, it will create a culture too. And learning from incidents to make sure that we're not repeating what has already happened. One thing that's very interesting to see is we're all focusing on safety, incidents reduction, and we see improvements. But interestingly, we see accident rates declining while we do not see fatality rates declining in the same pace. And it's because it's two different things. I mean, these are two rainbow puzzles that are kind of the same, but they are different in terms of complexity. And there are differences. Safety programs often focus on high probability, low consequent events. Slip, trips, and falls, and cuts, and things like that. And we are able to reduce those things. But fatalities do not necessarily appear in that kind of standard environment where people are in routine. They typically result from what's called high consequence but low probability events. They do not happen that often. So they're not top of the mind of the people. And they don't happen in the typical routine environment always, but often in maintenance activities, non-routine activities. And they are consequence not necessarily to the individual failure or behavior, but they are also consequence to process failure. The interaction of the whole organization, how well we are set up, how well we are working together, how well we are predicting things. Risks are not fully understood, and therefore we have a lack of mitigation. And you need a different type of culture. Yes, supporting each other is fine, but you also need a culture of operational discipline. Not every individual is able to judge whether a rule is valid and is able to judge whether his actions are causing risks for the whole environment, for the whole operation or not. So you need to follow the rules, although you may not fully understand why that's necessary. And then companies do not learn from incidents and near misses enough, and they are relying too much on single layers of protection. Think about the locomotive. If that breaks and fails, then somebody dies. This is how a proper safety management system should look. Each bar in this picture is an element, an aspect. And for a good reason, there is actually 3 layers of leadership at the bottom of the whole thing. And there are hazard identification and work instructions and contractor management and management of change, controls, organization, training, safety programs, and leadership. But in most of the cases, our safety management systems look like this, or worse. So, I'm always impressed about the one bar that represents the leadership in this picture. At least there is one bar left. But you can imagine if leadership does not pay attention and does not drive a proper safety culture, then that's the reason for having accidents. And that's the reason for not preventing people from losing their lives. So, in consequence, where do you want to be? Transform your approach to achieve your objective. Create a risk-based approach. Risk-based culture means we are focusing on the top reasons that may impact our operations, our mine, and may cause people to lose their lives, and at the same time, the company to lose its right to operate in the worst case. It's about shifting the thinking. It's about controls. It's about building capability and organizational readiness. Now, come on. Shift thinking from compliance to aiming for world-class performance. Go beyond just fulfilling regulatory requirements. It's about making sure we do not have accidents. Zero is possible. This means focus on hazards, focus on understanding the risks, because only then you will be able to mitigate them. And focus on leadership. Focus on acting as example and paying attention and driving the culture in the organization. Controls. You can only establish controls if you fully understand the risk involved in your operation. And that links quite nicely with what my predecessor speaker was talking about, starting early. The earlier you start to understand the risks involved in your operation, the better you will be able to mitigate them already in the design phase, but constantly throughout the whole process of constructing and operating. So hazard identification and risk assessment is the most important part of the whole thing. And then establishing a regime of controls to make sure that mitigation is happening. Yep, I'm coming to the end. Building capability. The better your people are educated, the more knowledgeable your people are, the better they will be able to work together to create a strong operational performance and excellence. And ready the organization. Align, have a vision. What do you want to achieve? Take everybody with you. And be transparent about plans and actions, and have clear ownership and accountability for the transformation. And don't forget about change management. Any transformation will cause resistance because people don't like to change. They have been working like this for 20, 30, 40 years. So they think it's okay, it's fine. And you need to take that seriously and apply some good change management approaches. And don't forget about the most important ingredient for safety culture, which is leadership. It's about you. Thank you very much.
So the next presenter is Rob Foulkes, who's an Associate Director with Critical Resource, and his presentation title is Securing the Social License to Operate, Insights from Emerging Good Practice.
Thanks, Chris. So Critical Resource, we're an advisory firm and we work on engagement, stakeholder engagement with mining and oil and gas companies around the world, including here in the Balkans and across Southeast Europe. What I want to talk about today is one specific reason why mines sometimes fail, which is the inability to establish constructive conversations with the project's stakeholders and critics, and also to look at some of the approaches that companies have taken to addressing that sort of potential flaw. So the first basic point, which will be familiar, I think, to everyone in this room, is that companies have a lot of very difficult conversations that they need to have with their stakeholders in order to progress a project. There's going to be a range of individuals and groups at the local level, communities, local authorities, at the national level with government, civil society and others, and indeed at the international level, all of whom will have concerns across a range of issues, from the environmental impacts, the economic and social benefits that a mine can bring, human rights, corruption, a broad range of issues. And these can make for some really, frankly, difficult conversations. They're often very emotive topics, sometimes technically very complex and difficult for non-specialists to understand. These are conversations that aren't just between two interlocutors that happens once and there's agreement. These need to be ongoing with a shifting cast of characters. Management can change within the company, local elections can change the mayors, different issues can emerge. So finding a way to establish a trust and agreement over time in that situation can be very difficult. And finally, and I think frequently the most important issue that we come across is that, rightly or wrongly, there's a great deal of suspicion on both sides, companies and their stakeholders, as to the motivations and trustworthiness of the other side. So in that context, it can be, as I say, very difficult to have the conversations that are needed to build trust to allow the project to go ahead. Without that, mines can fail and do fail in various different ways. Companies may find they're unable to access resources in the first place. They may find there are obstacles to project development and operation. They may find that the reputational impacts are too great to justify proceeding. So I'll talk now about some of the I guess efforts at innovation that companies have undertaken to try and overcome this, to try and find ways of talking more constructively to stakeholders. A couple of things before I do. I think one thing to note is that companies can't do this stuff alone. They need to be working in a context that allows for the right kind of conversation, and government and local authorities are very often a critically important part of establishing that environment. Second point is that the criteria for success needs to be realistic. I think we're not talking here about ways of bringing everybody around to support for a project. Given the range of motivations and perspectives, that's often an unrealistic and potentially unnecessary hurdle to be aiming for. I think rather it's about creating a dialogue that is open to those who want to participate in a sort of constructive manner. So there's three broad approaches that I want to touch on with some brief case studies. So the first is the idea of independent advisory panels. So this is a model where companies will arrange for independent experts to review and advise on and report back on the performance of a project. Typically, the panels will be put together with a combination of local and international experts who carry weight with stakeholders who are observing a project and who have knowledge of the particular issues that are relevant to that project, be it, for example, cyanide or tailings, water management, for example. They'll be given access to full information on the project, able to talk to management, able to do their own independent field research. And on the basis of that, we'll have a reporting schedule that often includes both sort of behind closed doors feedback to the company, as well as public reports and statements. And when it works well, this model can be very effective at making sure that stakeholders have information about a project that they can trust, while at the same time it's information that the company knows. They may not agree with the conclusions, but they at least know that it's coming from a well-informed source and has been produced in a constructive spirit. and that can help to limit the scope for more malicious or misinformed information about a project to shape the dialogue. It can also, when companies are open to this, be a good way for companies to receive independent feedback from experts on their performance and thereby strengthen the work they're doing. So a couple of examples there. An early model developed by the British oil and gas company BP in Indonesia, which has been running successfully for many years. More recently, an example from Armenia where a gold company, Lydian International, has more recently set up a panel. Again, in both instances, helped to provide information that has allowed more constructive conversations between stakeholders and the companies. So the second model is what I'm calling here formal dialogue processes. So the idea that rather than having a series of disconnected bilateral conversations between a company and various different stakeholders, that a structured, planned, multi-stakeholder process can be set up instead or as well. These processes typically will be independently chaired, often under the auspices, or at least with the approval of an involvement of local government, national government, bringing in a range of other concerned stakeholders. Often the first point of discussion, which can take some time, is to establish a modus operandi and an agenda so that the conversations about what the dialogue should involve, which can often derail things, are dealt with at the beginning. Again, when these are effective, they can be a great way of getting opposed parties who might otherwise find it difficult to sit down together to come to the same room and to engage and gradually to sort of build up trust and talk openly to each other. They have the advantage of being structured and documented in a way that makes it much easier for an agreement to stick. So rather than the same issue coming up every year and needing to be renegotiated, there's more chance, at least, of it being sort of dealt with and an agreed way forward that people stick with. And from a stakeholder point of view, it can give a guarantee that there is some meaningful opportunity to provide input to project decisions and thereby deal with some of the concerns and opposition. Again, a couple of examples here. Tintaya, BHP's, formerly BHP's mine in Peru, an early and successful example that's been sort of rolled out across Peru. The Pebble example, as I'm sure many of you will be aware, hasn't had the same success, but I think is interesting to look at for the approach that they've taken. A huge amount of effort was put into establishing a shared scientific basis for discussions before then trying to go on to talk about the substance of people's views on the project. For various reasons, didn't have the success that the companies were hoping, but I think still some useful lessons there. And thirdly, a very common model, again I'm sure will be familiar, of participatory monitoring, i.e. the idea that stakeholders should have a direct involvement in the monitoring of a project or a mine's impacts. Generally it's done around environmental impacts, but equally on socioeconomic issues. Can range from very basic involvement of community members working alongside company staff in the monitoring of impacts, but I think works better and really helps to establish the trust that companies are looking for when there's a fully independent parallel process that allows stakeholders to access and analyse their own information. As with all these models, tricky to do well. Often companies struggle to generate enough commitment and interest from their stakeholders. Finding ways to fund this while also maintaining its independence can also be very difficult. But again, when it works well, it can really add to the credibility of a company's claims that it's performing well, and can help a lot in providing assurance to stakeholders as well. So, just to conclude very briefly, some thoughts for the applicability of some of these sorts of models in the Balkans. In general terms, it seems like countries in this region, as in many other parts of the world, could benefit from some of these sorts of approaches. I think there is, in the work that we've done, a certain suspicion of sources of information, particularly when information is coming from companies directly. You can understand why people feel that way. Some of these models can help create more trust in information that's being received. Often you have active, engaged civil society in this part of the world, creating scope for some of these sorts of these conversations. And I think there's also the idea of international standards resonates quite strongly, given the sort of the history of the mining sector in some countries in this part of the world. And we often see there's appetite for sort of new forms of engagement, new levels of transparency. So that's my thoughts. Thank you.